Hello and welcome to another web development tutorial. If you've seen my last video, you saw me transforming one of my open source projects from using Webpack to using Vite and Rollup. And in this video, I shared why I did this switch and also some of the features I now have by using Vite. One of those is the ability to run a dev server to test my library. So I can just do in my library here, which is the Typescript Gallery. I'll leave a link to it in the description. So here I can just run npm run dev, and this will start here a dev server. And in the browser, I'm now served here with a list of tests I've created. Those are just very simple HTML pages which showcase how my lib works. For example, if I go to the gallery test, you see the lib loads. I can test here the sum view, click on different images, have full screen, swiping works. So all that stuff works, which is nice. So it gives me a good way to manually test my library. But you also see there are already quite a few tests I have here. For example, a scale mode test and then also a thumb scroller test, which loads different versions for the thumb scroller. If I make changes to the library, which I now did again, so I did a huge refactoring, I always have to check all those tests manually, look at those, and it's very likely that I missed something. So that's why I need to include unit testing. And not just unit testing. So I really need to test the behavior of my library and how it manipulates the DOM. So the ideal approach would have been right from the beginning doing test-driven development. But to be honest, for my personal projects, which I just do as a side, so I have a full-time job as a software developer and I don't have so much time to spend on my side projects. Now I think it's finally time to write some tests because I currently have some time. So I want to do it right now and also take you along and show you how I approach this, because there's a few things to decide here. There are many testing frameworks, there are many ways to test, and choosing the right one is all based on the requirements I have. And that's typical whenever you develop something. It all starts with requirements and you have to be very clear about those, because otherwise you might choose the wrong technology and the wrong framework. So for me, a requirement is coming from how my library works here. It does a lot of DOM manipulations, which means it inserts divs into other divs, it wraps divs, it assigns CSS or styles to certain divs, and it also queries the width and the height of existing divs, doing calculations based on how the current images are sized. All that information is required for the library to work. So I cannot just do a typical simple unit test. The unit test could be a good start for me, just at the function level, providing some input, providing some mocks, and making sure that calculations I do are correct. So this would be the first stage. But then I also want to test if the library really works correct with a DOM. So figuring out what testing framework to use will be the first step. In the past, I've usually used Jest, and with my React projects, the React testing library was always a good choice because it provides also a way to check what's done to the DOM. But I'm not sure if this is enough, so I set to use Perplexity, which I like to do some deep dives nowadays. It's a quite good AI because it also gives you links to the sources it pulls from. And now let's have a look how I try to figure out which framework to use. So at first I have a very simple prompt describing what I want to do and also giving already some directions. Basically, I have a JavaScript Typescript library, which I want to test, and I want to check if the manipulations it does on the DOM are correct. And it gives me some suggestions. So DOM testing library, Jest, SnapDOM, and here down there we have Vitest, which directly stood out to me because I already use Vite. As you've seen in the last video, I switched to using Vite. This seems to be a very simple setup for me, but it doesn't provide a virtual DOM, which I would have to provide by combining it, for example, with a DOM testing library. So far, this looks good, and I tell Perplexity that and also specify my testing use case a bit more. So what I want to do, create a div container, pass it to the library, and then observe what the library does to this div. So inserting stuff, making manipulations. So here JSDOM comes up, which sounds promising. Also setup seems very easy. But before I now directly jump into JSDOM, I first usually want to know about some advantages, disadvantages, how it's maintained, and what are the limitations. And for that also Perplexity is quite good. I have a free account, but I have a few pro searches in the beginning. So every day I have a few pro searches and I like to use that feature. So now it gives me some advantages, disadvantages, and here under the disadvantages, there's one which is relevant for me because client width client height, stuff like that, and also CSS support. Those are limited, but those are very important for me, as I said in the beginning when I talked about the requirements. I do a lot of manipulations which are based on the current state of the DOM, so curing width of elements, height of elements, applying CSS, all that stuff. So here again gives me some alternatives: Puppeteer, Playwright, Cypress. I've heard of all of those. I haven't used them yet, so again I want to know a bit more. So first I explain that I actually make heavy use of CSS and stuff like that, and now I specify my use case a bit more. So I run in a dev container with Ubuntu. I just want to know if Puppeteer or Playwright work in such an environment. So they are headless browser environments, which sounds like it should work, but still, what other libraries are required for it? I want to know that. So here again, I get a bit of information, what I need to install. So a few additional libraries. Down there, I even get a list how I would set up my Docker file. Also, we get links here, which I usually check. So I don't just rely solely on this summary here, but it gives me a good first idea, and then I head to the different home pages and also do my own deeper research using Google. But for a quick overview, this is good. Next, I want to know how Puppeteer compares against Playwright. So advantages, disadvantages, stuff like that. And at the end of all this, just bringing everything together. Okay, I still want to use Vitest as my testing framework, and then Puppeteer sounds like a good choice for me. So here I just get a quick example how to set it up with Vitest. This is also something I would then use for a first test, just to see if it indeed works. So in my Docker container, I can use this code to get a quick proof of concept, which is very important. So before I spend hours writing my tests and then running into some limitations, I first usually play around with it. So proof of concept, and then in this proof of concept I will also do some tests, for example getting the width of elements, all that stuff, just seeing if it indeed works, so if the requirements I have can be fulfilled by this setup. And now we're at the end of my little research, or let's not call this research yet, more like a brainstorming. The real research would follow up now by diving into some of the links provided by Perplexity and digging a bit deeper, also using Google to make sure that the libraries I now intend to use are the right choice. So if it's the right choice, you usually only know once you're into the project, but you can at least, based on the requirements you have, already rule out some problems that might come up later on, but you can never be 100% sure with that. Anyways, I now finish my research and then set up the first POC. So I finished the setup of my testing environment now, and I want to quickly walk you through it. I also created a quick proof of concept. So yeah, let's have a look and see if Puppeteer is indeed sufficient for what I have in mind for the testing. So first of all, I had to install some dependencies, which are Puppeteer. So you can just install it using npm install and also Vitest. So Vitest is basically the unit testing framework I want to use. So as I said, I want to write some unit tests, but I also then want to run some Puppeteer tests from this. Those would rather be integration tests because I'm testing the complete library from the outside and not individual functions. But I can use Vitest for both. Next, let's head to the config, where it's very simple to set up Vitest. So I just set up here under define config a test environment. In this case, I use Node because that's what Puppeteer is based on. And that's all I have to do here. So that's how easy it is to use Vitest and set it up. So here under package.json, I also included a test script, Vitest run, which will run the tests a single time. And next, I need to install the dependencies into my Docker container. And that's also another reason why a Docker container or a dev container is a great thing here, because I don't have to play around directly on my host system, possibly clutter it with dependencies, which in the end I might not need. For example, if I now test a framework here, install dependencies for it, and then decide, oh, it's not the right one, I need another one, then if I do all this on my host system, which is Windows, it can be a pain to remove everything again. So here in the Docker file, I just have to install Chrome. You find enough guides on how to do it if you do a Google. Also, the link to this library to my GitHub is included, so you can just check it out and then you get all the code and see how everything's done. But in essence here, the Google Chrome stable will be installed instead of my Ubuntu system I'm using here in the dev container. So once this is done, I can directly write my first test. And I did a little dummy test, which is kind of the proof of concept, also my playground. And if you look at this, describe it before all, after all this stuff. This might look very familiar if you're coming from Jest. Basically, you don't have to learn anything new also down here except to be. So this is the same syntax like you would have in Jest. So choosing Vitest for me is a very natural fit because I already know Jest and hence I know how to write the tests for Vite. So if we're looking at the code here, you see first I import some stuff from Vitest to set up the tests, and then from Puppeteer I just import Puppeteer, which as we see here is a Puppeteer node. And then here I have this before all hook, which is run before all my test suits. So here with this scribe, I basically define a test suite, and in it I can run different tests. And I want to make sure every time I enter such a test suite, I'll have set up a browser and a page. So those are the essential things you do with Puppeteer. First, this Puppeteer launch will, as you see here, launch a browser in headless mode. And then with this page command, this is like creating a tab in the browser, so an empty page for now. And we then use this page here to load HTML and also JavaScript and execute it. It's also important at the end, after all, I want to close the browser again. Now let's look at a very simple test I've written. This is basically taken directly over from Perplexity. So here I don't go fancy yet. I just wanted to very quickly get started. This first test here takes the page and I set a content. And in this case, just a simple div. This is also what I told Perplexity what I want to do. Then there is this evaluate function, which I can call to inject, in this case, further elements into this original div here. So for example, here I had a child, then I set some text content, I set a style, and then I appended here to this div we have initially created. And afterward, I can run some queries here. So this will remind you of jQuery if you've used it. So I try to get the child div, which I've just created here, and then I can again run evaluate. And this part is very important because it allows me to get the computed style of this element, which is important if you make changes to CSS via classes or via styles. You might use REM, you might use pixel values, you might use percent values. To write a real test, you might want to compare against pixel values. At least that's what I want to do later. So this is nice to have, and this already tells me that one very essential functionality I need for my testing is available. And here I can do some expects. So the color should be the red I defined up here, but here it's the computed style. Down here I do another test. This one I've written just to see exactly what I just told you, how sizes can be evaluated and checked. For example, here I set the size of the container, the width, to 10 rem, which is per default 160 pixels. So 1 rem is usually 16 pixels unless you tell the browser to use another value. Then I create a child, and for the child I set the width to 100%. As a consequence, this child should also have a width of 10 rem. Here I get the computed style for the width. So here the width should be 160 pixels, and we'll see in a second that this also works. And what you can also do, you can directly load HTML pages. And in this case, this is the local host. This is just the testing server. So let's just run my dev server here and now head to another dash down here. And now if we run this test suite, Headless Chrome will connect to my dev server, which is basically running all those pages here under demo. In this case, I just get the gallery HTML, and then I can get the content. I could print it out. So here I'm not doing anything, so I could also just remove it. But here I want to check, okay, this page will now contain image stages. And the way it's set up, the first image stage should have an opacity of 0. So that's a very simple test. And yeah, let's just run the test here, npm run test. It's very quick and everything passes. So if I would now set this to something else, for example, 50, let's say, yeah, is it 50? Run the test, and now it will fail. We can also have a look at our development server and confirm this. So if I had to test this manually, which is what I had to do till now, I would head to the gallery test here. And this page is set up to directly jump here to the image number 4. Now I would bring up the DevTools. I would inspect the images and look here at the first image stage and confirm, yes, the opacity is 0. If it wasn't, then all those images would be shown. So only the image that is active should have an opacity unequal 0. Okay, so this is already how I can automate some testing, but in the next video I want to be a bit more practical and show you how to really set it up without requiring such a dev server. So this was just showing you what you can do. You could also load pages from the internet, and that's also what Puppeteer is used for. So not just for testing, so you could do web scraping and stuff like that, but it's not the topic of this video. We want to write first some unit tests and then some integration tests using Puppeteer.